Michael Jordan, star of the 1996 film Space Jam, once said, "I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." In the world of video games, different people measure success differently. Some think that a game fails just because it gets a bad review score. Some think that a game fails because it doesn't make enough money. That's understandable. But what happens if a game is suddenly pulled from shelves and digital storefronts? That sounds like a special kind of failure to me. Today we're going to talk about a company that produced 3 games that suffered this fate. A company that has failed and succeeded many times throughout its history. Let's talk about PlatinumGames and the lost Activision Trilogy. You're already familiar with PlatinumGames if you watched my last review, but it's worth going into more detail this time around. Platinum was founded in 2007 by former Capcom staff who had created some of the company's most well-known series as well as cult classics. Between 2009 and 2012, they released 5 original games through a partnership with Sega and quickly garnered a following. Things only got bigger for them in the following years, and Platinum gained a reputation as a company that delivered engaging, technical, and exhilarating action games. Even some of Platinum's lesser titles have a great sense of charm to them. They always stood out from the crowd. I would even argue that a lot of gamers evangelized Platinum because while other developers were busy pushing for cinematic drama or following modern homogenized trends, Platinum was making games that were unapologetically games. Many of them felt like they would fit in the crop of action games from the 2000s, but with more finesse and technology behind them. But not only was Platinum getting attention for original projects like Bayonetta, they had proven that they could take over the development of other IPs and turn them into something cool with Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. This is probably what caught the attention of Activision. One of the largest publishers in the world, they're mostly known for making bank off of Call of Duty, and they're not to be confused with their parent company, Activision Blizzard, which oversees their operations, as well as Blizzard's, obviously. But the point is that Activision had a long history of publishing a hefty amount of licensed games for Nickelodeon, Hasbro, and many other companies. It is because of these licensing deals that none of these games can be bought today. Digital copies don't exist, so I had to call in a few favors and scour eBay just to get a hold of these games, as some of them are going for very high prices. And let's get into that first game that Activision contracted Platinum to make. The Legend of Korra. I remember this game feeling like it was announced out of nowhere, but I suppose a collaboration like this wasn't a bad fit. Platinum's brand of action could work very well for a franchise with a focus on fantastic martial arts. I had some friends who were fans of the show, and they were really excited at the prospect of what this game could be, but pretty quickly they ended up being confused when they realized that this was going to be a cheaper, downloadable title instead of something with a full price tag, like Revengeance. I'm not very familiar with the Avatar franchise. I've seen the movie more than any episodes of the show, not because I like the movie, but because it's really funny to show it to fans and watch them get pissed off. Everyone I know who's seen The Legend of Korra always has some kind of significant complaint about the show's quality after the first season, so I was never really in a hurry to binge The Last Airbender just to get to it. That's something you should keep in mind about all of the properties these games belong to. I was never really a fan of any of them, so I don't think that I have any biases in that regard. But this isn't really about the shows or the toy lines, it's about the games. Things start off on rocky footing right out of the gate. Opening with a minigame where the rules aren't explained is never a great sign. But after this, we're treated to a cutscene where Korra loses all of her powers, like it's Metroid Prime or something. Because of this, the first level feels really rough to play. Normally, Korra's elemental stances will create some kind of projectile and give you a bit of distance from which to attack. Without that, the game feels really clunky. Over the course of the adventure's short runtime, you will get all of the powers back, and things do open up a bit. Waterbending has good range, earthbending has slow but powerful attacks, fire is close range, but you have really quick, rapid jab combos, and airbending gives you massive area of effect attacks. But there aren't really many situations where you need to use one style over another on enemies. If anything, you'll want to commit to a style early on, as the primary way to get better combos and attacks is to gain experience points through using a style. So if you're just not feeling the earth or air styles when you eventually get them, you're probably just going to focus on the ones you already had, and then those later ones will get worse over time. As far as defensive capabilities, you will want to block more than you dodge. Perfect blocking gives you a quick-time event where you can deal massive damage. You can also pull this off by stunning foes with combos. Most enemies are these soldiers who have a few slightly different moves, but there are also martial artists who will pose more of a threat, at least in theory. There's a parry quick-time event that will come up when you fight them, and it kind of trivializes them. The game only has 2 boss-type encounters, and they're huge damage sponges, especially if you don't counter their attacks. And that can be frustrating because the visual tells for counter hits aren't very consistent in this game, especially compared to other Platinum games. It feels harder than it's meant to be to pull them off. You can see that I was having a lot of fun during these parts near the end of the game where you can barely see what's happening because they double up giant bosses on you. Korra is also pretty fragile. She can't take a lot of hits, and health pickups aren't that common. The game just doesn't have a lot going on and gets repetitive quickly. Despite being very short, it feels like a slog. And it's also pretty frustrating due to the controls being less than great. I can see a lot of new players or people who aren't great at action games getting frustrated. It feels like Platinum forgot that maybe this wasn't for the more hardcore audience out there. Especially when you consider how the first stage is intentionally really bad. I bet a lot of people gave up immediately after it. But to break up the monotony, there is an endless runner type game that you have to do at a few points. The timings here also get pretty tight as you speed up, to the point where sometimes it felt like my inputs were just being dropped. But there's hardly any consequence for failing, so you can brute force these stages. They don't really get interesting until the very end of the game when you have all of your elemental abilities. And even then, they're not that great. Also, you don't get a Devil Trigger type ability until the game is basically over, and it causes your moveset to feel kind of incomplete. I've heard people say that replaying this game with everything is much more fun, but I still wouldn't say it's all that entertaining. Sure, you can finish fights faster because you've got more upgrades and you have all of the different elemental styles, but if anything, this just makes the game even more boring. I had no drive to find hidden collectibles or get high scores. But how does this game manage at capturing the look and feel of the property it's based on? That is part of the appeal of licensed games, after all. Honestly, I think the graphics look really flat. The character models look okay, considering that you don't often see them up close, but the environments just look incredibly bland. It almost does the show's art design a disservice. It definitely seems like Platinum was aware of these shortcomings, as almost any time that something would call for a cutscene, it's done in 2D animation instead. The quality level is definitely not on par with the show, and many cutscenes are so short that I wonder why they even bothered. While we're discussing the show, don't get your hopes up for seeing your favorite characters here. Most of this game is just Korra talking to herself. Mako and Bolin only cameo at the beginning and end in the stadium. Jinora shows up to tell you how to get your bending back, and Uncle Iroh is just a shopkeeper in the menu. Everyone else is just not around. The plot concerns an evil wizard named Hundun who escaped the spirit world, and he's mad at the Avatar for banishing him there a long time ago. He seems to want to sow chaos across the world, but because this game did not have much of a budget, we don't really see any of that stuff playing out. You do fight him at the end in the spirit world along with his conjoined twin. The developers tried their hardest to give you a Platinum-style ending with a bunch of quick-time events, but I was not really motivated to care about anything that was going on by this point. I think this game should have just been a retelling of the events of the show, but they probably didn't have the budget for that, so instead we got something that feels very unimportant and honestly does not motivate me to want to watch the show, which I think is a problem for a licensed game. Reviews for Korra were not terribly kind, and I understand why. This game just isn't worth seeking out unless you're a Korra superfan. Even then, I'd say not to bother because there's no way to own it now. It was digital only, so you need somebody else's account who purchased it prior to 2017 if you want to check it out. I agree with Eurogamer's review when it said that Korra was a misfire that means Platinum's name no longer guarantees quality. Everything about this screams no budget. There aren't even subtitles. Part of me suspects one reason this game didn't get the development time it needed was because the Legend of Korra's final 2 seasons would finish airing by the end of 2014. Someone at Nickelodeon or Activision probably thought that the game would sell best if it was released while the show was still active. And that might be true, especially since the game seems to take place in between seasons 2 and 3. From reading an interview with Platinum, they seem to be aware that this project would have a reduced budget and time frame. They might have just seen that as a challenge. I suppose the results could have been worse, but they certainly weren't great. But it's interesting to note that this game actually came out 2 days before Bayonetta 2. I feel like that probably masked the disappointment of Korra. It didn't matter if Platinum had just put out some lackluster licensed game, because they had also just released one of the best action games of the year. So most people probably just let this game fade from their mind while they had fun with Bayo. Until 1 year later, when the second installment in this trilogy was announced. Transformers Devastation wasn't based on whatever iteration of the franchise was airing at the time, but rather the original generation. Autobots and Decepticons are sporting their 80s designs, though it seems like the plot of this game took more inspiration from the comic books that continued the show's storyline. I haven't watched much of the original Transformers because it was before my time, but I remember watching some of Beast Wars and Armada back in the day. Other than that, I haven't really kept up with the series, although I hear those Cybertron games were pretty good. When Devastation was announced, I started to get deja vu. Another Platinum licensed game with Activision. Ooh, here we go again. Except that this game was not only released physically, they were charging the full $60 for it. So surely that meant it had a bigger budget and they put more care behind it, right? Well, yes. Devastation feels far better to play than Korra, but that's also because it clearly takes a lot of influence from Bayonetta, as dodging attacks slows down time. Your combos feel much more alive and flow properly. They have a satisfying amount of force behind them, especially when you end a combo with the transforming attacks. I like that these can also be used to quickly rush over to new enemies if you finished off the one in front of you just before triggering the transformation. You can also use guns to take out enemies from afar. They feel a bit clunky and tacked on, but they can get you out of a jam, especially against flying enemies. The 5 playable Autobots all have a unique skill they can use in combat, as well as an ultimate attack that does tremendous damage. Their transforming attacks are also a bit different as well. This is where things get a little iffy for me. Each Transformer doesn't actually have their own moveset. It's dependent on the melee weapon they have equipped. And this is sort of a loot-based game, so you might spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out which weapons have the best stats or damage types. You can buy or fuse weapons and spend additional money on randomized buffs for your character. It almost feels like an RPG, the kind of thing where endgame equipment really matters, except it doesn't. And I didn't really care about any of that. I don't enjoy this kind of loot system in a fast-paced action game. And I'd rather the weapons be tied to specific characters, or just be streamlined into something closer to, well, Bayonetta. I just would have preferred if the characters were a bit more distinctive. Grimlock feels the most different since he turns into a dinosaur instead of a car, but he's kind of bad as a result. Dino attacks are just too slow, and you have to mash a button to run while transformed, so any segments where you need to move quickly are kind of awful. Despite the combat controls being on par with other Platinum games, it feels like they forgot to put in a lock-on command. You can sort of make do without it, but sometimes you might get into a situation where 2 enemies are flanking you and the movement assist on your attacks doesn't want to aim at the same target that you had in mind, which seems like a weird oversight. Enemy variety in this game isn't great either. You've got ground troops and flying Decepticons, both of whom get more powerful versions later. Occasionally you fight a big robot arm, and Insecticon clones will show up later, but that's about it. That said, the game is definitely less repetitive than Korra. There are sections where they try to mix things up, with parts where you have to carry around some energon cubes, there's turret sections, defense missions, etc. It's not great, but it does help things from getting too boring. The game also tries to make up for that stuff by having a whole lot of different Decepticons to fight. How many? Well, there's Megatron, Starscream, Skywarp, Thundercracker, Soundwave with several of his mini-cassettes, Blitzwing, Shockwave, all 6 of the Constructicons who form Devastator, Kickback, Scrapnel, Bombshell, Motormaster, and his combined transformation as Menasor. And yes, you do fight these guys multiple times. Devastator and Megatron are fought several times just in the game's first level, and unfortunately the final boss isn't all that special because you just fight Megatron 2 more times and you're in space for the last one. But at least all of these bosses feel pretty good. They're not all memorable, but they play to the strengths of the combat, and they at least remembered to put characters from the show in this game. But much like Korra, this is a really short game, and it seems like they weren't even able to design enough levels this time around. Most of the city area is explored in the first stage, and so you just end up revisiting locations and backtracking a lot. It almost feels like they were trying to make an open world game, but there's no real freedom of movement. The only other environment in the game is a spaceship, which has a little more variety as far as obstacles and scenarios go, but visually most of it just looks like blue and purple hallways. If it wasn't so linear, I would probably get lost. The game does try to encourage exploring by hiding lots of chests, collectibles, and even Mass Effect-style codex entries all over the game world. But I was more interested in the massive list of challenge missions. Transformers has a lot more mileage if you're enjoying the combat than Korra did, which does offset the short campaign time by a bit. From a presentation level, this is a step up over Korra in every way. The cell shading looks really good, bright and dynamic, like an evolved version of the original cartoon. Even if there aren't that many Autobots in the game, most of them are voiced by their original cartoon actors, and that goes for a few of the Decepticons as well. It's pretty cool to see this kind of respect for 80s cartoons, considering how, in the time since, they're constantly being recycled and imagined for new generations. I'll also give a lot of props to the composers on this game, as the soundtrack is pretty great. Lots of badass rock music that definitely sounds like it could have been part of Revengeance if you just added some edgy lyrics. Definitely have a listen to some of the tracks, even if you don't care about this game. Things are a bit less fun when it comes to the pre-rendered cutscenes. They actually use 3D models this time, but they look a bit flat compared to the in-game graphics. Some of these scenes also feel incomplete. You can spot a few visual glitches with character models or the lighting, but others just feel like they didn't even have the money to spend on showing characters walking. This one early on cuts to black so that they didn't have to animate Devastator leaving the area. Halfway through the game, they finally start using the transition effects from the show, and this feels like another cost-cutting measure as these cutscenes feel pretty incomplete. What story there was is passable enough for this kind of game, but I think they got a little too far ahead of themselves. Megatron is trying to use an old Cybertronian ship to terraform the planet, which will kill all the humans. Optimus mentions how the ship was controlled by someone named Nova Prime, who went crazy. Eventually, he ends up in outer space with Megatron, and the only way Optimus can stop the terraforming process is to destroy an ancient flash drive with records of all of Cybertron's history, which he does. Optimus gives a speech as he falls back to Earth, and I honestly thought that they were going to kill him off here. But then it cuts back to Earth 1 second later, and he's totally fine. 2 other Autobots Skype in for brief cameos. I don't know who these guys are. There's a schematic for a Transformer that you can see on the screen for a second or two. I had no idea who that was either. Apparently it's a reference to something from the comic book, not the show. Then we get a post-credit scene, and it turns out that Nova Prime was on the ship the whole time, but now he woke up. The end. The story was written by someone who'd done a lot of work on the Transformers G1 comics, but they also added a fair amount of their own lore to this game. Maybe some of those ideas get followed up on in future comic books, but it probably would have been better if we had just seen them bear fruit in this game. The ending that we have feels like a lackluster tease for a sequel that's not going to happen. Also, can I just mention that the game is called Transformers Devastation, and Devastator is not really important in the game at all. Like, he's just a jobber. You just fight him a bunch as a big boss. It's like if they named the first BioShock after the Big Daddy. So I don't think that this game was worth $60, but it's much closer to what I would expect from Platinum. Their fingerprints feel all over this one. Had the budget and development time been a bit longer, I think they could have been able to design proper levels and put a little more meat on the bone. But if you're a Transformers or PlatinumGames fan, this is the game that's worth tracking down if you can, so long as the price is reasonable. That's something I should remind you. These games aren't for sale normally, so people are charging absurd fees for used copies online. I had to put in some work to find a fair price for a copy of the final game in this trilogy. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutants in Manhattan is not based on any previous incarnation of the franchise, though it seems that Platinum did take some visual cues from its origins as a comic book. Compared to the previous games we've covered, this one feels much more distinct. Platinum actually tried some things outside of their comfort zone here. For starters, it's intended to be an open-ended, cooperative experience. You could team up with 3 other players online and go through all of the levels together, mostly in whatever order you want. Obviously, there's nobody playing the game these days, but that's okay. If you're playing alone, you can just switch which turtle you want to control in the middle of play. AI handles the rest of them for you. Unfortunately, the controls are not as solid as the Transformers ones, but that doesn't mean there aren't some new ideas here. Turtles can perfectly dodge attacks and follow them up with the QuickTime event for extra damage, but with different timing, they can simply parry the attacks instead. These techniques can't be spammed though. Dodge too many times in a row, and you'll be stunned for several seconds. I don't mind this conceptually, but unfortunately, dodging is far less necessary than in other Platinum titles, because ninja powers are the real meat of this game. Each turtle has 4 ninja powers that you can set before a mission. These are powerful abilities that run off of cooldown timers and can be leveled up as you play through the game. It is always more efficient to just use as many of your powers as possible in a fight. Trying to dodge or set up combos feels kind of like a waste of time. To be fair, ninja powers might not be so great if you're actually playing online, because you only have 4 of them instead of 16. But when playing alone, it doesn't feel balanced at all. I'll give Platinum some more credit here, as about half of the levels are wide open areas that you can navigate efficiently. Turtles can climb up walls and glide around New York without any trouble. This is important because every level consists of fixed environments with randomly generated objectives. Go here and stop the bad guys, disarm this bomb, grab this alien thing and bring it over here. They're all quite bland and impersonal. You'll hear April bark the same generic orders over and over as you play.
Guys, I intercepted the enemy's comms. It sounds like they're about to destroy something. See if you can stop them.
Some levels lack the open environments and instead just use the same few hallways copy-pasted, and this is across multiple levels. Be prepared to do most stages twice, just with different lighting and gimmicks. But once you complete enough random tasks, the game lets you take on the level's boss, and unfortunately things don't really pick up from here. Every boss has 7 health bars and they're a mess to fight. It's hard to tell what's even going on, mostly because you've got 3 other Ninja Turtles jumping around and attacking. They just feel like spongy, incoherent bouts that take way too long, and they don't have much in the way of stakes since it's basically impossible to get a game over. This feels more like a simplistic arcade beat-em-up or a bad Diablo clone than the kind of action romp that Platinum knows how to make well. I'm going to try to say this as politely as I can. This game doesn't feel like Platinum made it. But it does feel like the company that made Mad World made Mutants in Manhattan. Except there's almost none of the creativity or charm that made Mad World fun to be found here. You could have told me that this game dropped in the mid to late 2000s, and I just might believe you. Compared to how bright and crisp the cell shading was in Transformers, things just look dull and muddy here. But they're also less stylized than some parts of Korra. Despite the badass cover, the in-game art doesn't match the style, instead looking like a fusion of a few different Ninja Turtles TV shows. The frame rate is only 30 FPS and dips at some points depending on the effects on screen. You might have noticed that I'm playing the Xbox 360 version here since it's what I could find, but the frame rate isn't better on newer consoles, in spite of claims by one of the producers that local multiplayer was cut so that the game could reach 60 FPS. That's awkward. Speaking of awkward, some of the pre-rendered cutscenes look like they were made in Source Filmmaker. There's just a stiffness to some characters, while others are clearly motion captured. I especially like how basically every cutscene ends in a white flash. Very cool. The saving grace is the voice cast. They're all pretty good, and I was surprised to learn that none of them have ever played these characters in other Ninja Turtles projects, considering that they all fit them quite well. But unfortunately, there's no real plot to speak of. Krang and Shredder are trying to destroy New York, so the Turtles stop them. I was kind of hoping that there might be a little more plot given that this game is longer than the previous two, but that's not the case. Ultimately, Mutants in Manhattan may be the worst of the 3 games in this trilogy, because despite some promising ideas, it doesn't have anywhere close to the momentum it needs to be fun for more than 20 minutes. I don't want to replay a single level, let alone the entire game. And yes, this didn't have the excuse of being a cheap downloadable title. I remember seeing a lot of unsold copies in stores, and yet, just 8 months after release, it was pulled from the shelves. Now none of the 3 games that we've covered today can be purchased legitimately. This goes for several other licensed games that Activision published as well. The Transformers Cybertron series and some of the Marvel superhero games of years past are among those that can no longer be purchased. I've never heard any rumors of these games being re-released, and I don't know who would have to sign off on that. It doesn't do consumers or developers any favors to have products that just can't be purchased. But at the end of the day, these just aren't worth seeking out. Even if you're a longtime Platinum fan, I don't think you're going to get anything new out of playing Transformers, even though that's the best one. You might as well just boot up Revengeance or Bayonetta again. The concept of failed art is quite interesting to me. You can learn just as much from what goes wrong with certain games as you can from the ones that truly excel. But it's the fact that these games are lost to history that's really why I wanted to talk about them. But let's be honest, if some unknown developer had made these, this video would not exist. So now we put on our thinking caps and try to figure out what happened. Just how did Platinum get into the business of making low-budget licensed games? There's not a whole lot of concrete data to pull from, and I had to sift through a lot of assumptions that people discussing this stuff online have made, so keep in mind that I'm just sort of theorizing here. Nobody knows for sure what went down. First, let's talk about Activision. By the mid-2010s, the number of licensed games that the company produced was starting to decrease. This is probably because they weren't generating as much revenue as they did back in the 2000s. It was a safer bet to stop outsourcing projects and have Activision's homegrown teams focus on properties they already owned and were confident in, such as Call of Duty, Destiny, Skylanders, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Guitar Hero, and Tony Hawk. Now, you'll notice that not all of these ended up panning out for Activision. Destiny was dropped years ago, and the teams responsible for everything except Call of Duty are now just providing support on Call of Duty. But I'm just trying to guess at what Activision was thinking at the time. They probably decided to wind down their licensed games division and chose not to renew any contracts that they had with clients such as Nickelodeon or Hasbro. But they still had some properties that they either were contractually obligated to develop games for, or the budgets for those projects had already been allocated for them. So maybe in an effort to try and drum up interest in these projects, the decision was made to get a development studio with a hardcore following. That way, they might be able to squeeze some more sales from people who aren't necessarily fans of the properties, but are fans of the studio. It doesn't seem like the worst strategy in the world, but I can't find any financial information to suggest that any of these games put up real numbers. The budgets were likely low enough that they either made some profit or didn't lose much money. But that's me being optimistic. Either way, the Platinum Trilogy does represent the end of Activision's licensed games. The only other one I could find was released about a month after Mutants in Manhattan, a Ghostbusters game that failed so hard its developer shut down within days of release. From then on, there's no new licensed games released by Activision. It's all the in-house teams working on in-house franchises until ultimately the call was made to divert efforts towards Call of Duty, which is where things seem to be at the present. There is one interesting exception to this. Robert Conkey, a key producer from Activision who worked with Platinum on the trilogy, went on to work with From Software on Sekiro. So it seems like his experience working with Japanese developers didn't go to waste. But I wouldn't expect Activision to continue to work with Japanese companies on outside projects. It just doesn't seem to mesh with their recent restructuring. But now let's talk about Platinum. To put it simply, I think that they got overconfident about their ability to manage several different development teams at once. Platinum was able to put out a frightening number of projects in a relatively short span of time. Between 2009 and 2019, they released 15 games from 5 different publishers. Yes, there are Japanese studios such as Spike Chunsoft or From Software that have beaten that record, but they're subsidiaries of larger corporations. Platinum is a privately held company, and they're more reliant on outside partners to give them investments and properties that they can use to make their games. And those properties are another important aspect. For their first 5 games, Platinum was trying very hard to produce their own IPs. And while they definitely acquired a cult audience for their work, most of their games did not sell very well. If creating new IPs wasn't profitable, then developing games with pre-existing ones would have been a safer bet. That's why after shipping a Metal Gear spin-off, you see Platinum picking up Avatar, Transformers, Ninja Turtles, Star Fox, Nier, and Grand Blue Fantasy. These contracts got Platinum work they might not have had otherwise, and they could put that money towards the new IPs that they really wanted to make, even if they were riskier endeavors. And they definitely were riskier. Despite some acclaim, The Wonderful 101 and Bayonetta 2 suffered from being exclusive to the Wii U. But the greatest suffering came when Scalebound, an action game that they were developing for Microsoft, was cancelled after years of development. I think this event put Platinum in a worse place financially than the lack of success the Activision Trilogy might have had. Sinking years of time and money into a project only to have the publisher pull the plug is the kind of move that kills companies. Ultimately, Platinum has recovered from what may have been a tumultuous period. Nier Automata released in early 2017 and sold 1 million copies in its first month. Hideki Kamiya, co-founder of Platinum and director of Scalebound, credited this game with saving the company. While Bayonetta 3 was announced by the end of the year, things were relatively quiet for Platinum after Nier until the 2019 release of Astral Chain, a game in which key staff from all 3 of the Activision titles were involved. Not only do I think that both of these games are among Platinum's best works yet, but they also have a lot of effort put into their stories, side content, and world. They feel like more complete packages than most of the previous action fare that the company had made. The ambition to do something greater in scope finally came through. In one aspect or another, many of Platinum's games could be seen as failures. Whether it's because they didn't get good reviews, they didn't make enough money, or they were pulled from the shelves. But in spite of all of that, they've still succeeded where it mattered most. In 2020, Platinum announced that they had secured enough funding to try self-publishing several of their upcoming games. They also secured a new secondary studio to add 100 more staffers. Platinum has at least 3 big games in various stages of development right now. It's an exciting time, but I also hope that they don't repeat the mistakes of the past and spread themselves too thin. After all, the last thing anybody wants from Platinum is another lost trilogy. Thank you for watching. My audio probably doesn't sound that great right now, a little more echoey than usual. That's because I'm kind of in the middle of a move right now, so you're not going to see another video from me for a bit, at least until I get everything sorted out. I really wanted to push to get this project done before then, because things are about to get a little more hectic. This was originally intended to be a review of just Transformers Devastation, but it became pretty clear to me pretty quickly that I was going to have to cover all 3 of these games in order to kind of get the full context. I'm a big Platinum fan, if you couldn't tell, and so playing these games is not something I really thought I was ever going to get the opportunity to do. So shoutouts to a friend of mine who actually had Korra, and I could play it on his profile, and eBay, of course, for getting me a Ninja Turtles copy. On the 27th, there is apparently going to be a Platinum briefing or a live stream. I didn't know about this until yesterday, so great timing. Maybe go check that out if you want some kind of update on what the company is doing. Also, if you're on Twitter, you might have noticed that Axe Studios has been putting out screenshots lately of upcoming content from Y2K and the 1.5 expansion, you could say, sort of a free update. It sounds like they're getting closer to release, and of course, when that happens, that's going to be a pretty big project that I will be undertaking. So you can follow Axe Studios for more updates until then. And of course, consider sharing the video and things like that. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.